I did want to walk through some key funding channels and financing mechanisms that many of you are probably already aware of, but wanted to run through it so we have kind of like a common language and it's a baseline understanding of what some of those channels look like. So first, looking at funding. So we can think about funding as money that does not have to be repaid. So it's typically coming from government agencies or through other private foundations, community foundations, other entities. The ultimate sources of that funding could be from local taxes, local fees, donations, other public sources. And I'd group these in four main categories. So the first one, looking at grants and requests for proposals. So typically we'll see that from government agencies, right? Local, regional, state, federal, through their grant programs. Foundations also have grant programs. RFPs often released by government agencies, but also other types of public and private entities. A couple differences between grants and RFPs. Typically, grants are going to have specific goals or categories or some kind of objective, and typically soliciting applications where they'll make multiple awards. Requests for proposals typically have a more specific scope of work that folks are responding to, and typically only one contract is awarded, although there are some instances where they'll split some of the scope, some aspects of the scope up so they have multiple awards. We'll get more into grant writing tips and everything at our next session. The other category would be then sponsorship. So this could come from a variety of sources: public, private, nonprofit, academia. It's more so reaching out and requesting sponsorship. Some corporations do have sponsorship programs where you can go through their portal or go through some kind of briefer application process to request funding. This could be for specific events and programs, sometimes for an entire organization if it's mission aligned. And in some instances, if you're looking to receive sponsorships, there are certain benefits that you might be providing, such as for events, are you going to be providing discounted tickets or free tickets or other promotion benefits? So sponsorships, definitely a key source of funding. Donations, of course, another one. That could be set up to be one time or recurring, reaching out to individuals or corporations or other major donors. Crowdfunding has come up, I would say, I don't know, like 5 or 10 years ago as a pretty common approach. If there's a specific project or initiative or need, to then crowdfund from multiple sources and from the community and other entities. Some corporations also have employee gift matching programs that can double the employee's charitable contributions, and then you can also find major donors who can provide larger amounts of funding. And then finally, we can also look at fee for service models. So I think most commonly, a lot of nonprofits will charge some kind of modest fee for events that they organize, for conferences or workshops. It's a way to bring some revenue in. There could be a member due structure or a partner due structure if it's like a networked program. And also thinking about consultant services. I'm sure many of you are getting tapped to provide expertise, to provide guidance, to review this, to help with community engagement. You could set that up as a fee-for-service model, thinking about, what are people commonly reaching out to you for? What are some key offerings that you could provide? And then what would be the cost of that in terms of staff time or any resources, and kind of setting those rates, making sure that you make it clear that compensation is a critical part of the work that you do, right? You can't just be giving away your time. So I would say these kind of are the four main buckets in terms of funding. So again, monies that don't have to be repaid. Then we can look at financing mechanisms. So financing differs from funding in that they must be repaid over time, or there's some kind of upfront investment or upfront capital that's needed to then unlock the financing mechanism. So there is a business case that's needed, right, or some kind of repayment model. So one type of mechanism would be loans provided by various financial institutions. It's really important to look at the interest rates and payment terms and ensuring that you're able to satisfy those terms contractually and based on your financial model. Many nonprofits can also qualify for no interest loan programs, and I know with the CARES Act, there were some grants that were provided to nonprofits and other organizations that actually did not need to be repaid. So I think it's worth looking into that. I mean, I think we're LGC, we as an organization, we're trying to track that at a high level. So we'll definitely keep folks posted if we hear of other opportunities like that. Microloans are also another opportunity where typically microloans from financial institutions are defined as $50,000 or less. So that could be maybe something that you look for to provide some bridge funding or to fill a gap that you might have to implement your program. Credit lines are also another option. That would be a pre-approved credit line. The benefit of this is it's flexible. You're not getting a loan for a certain amount of funding. You have a flexible credit line, and this could be a flexible solution if there is an immediate pinch and there's an immediate need for payroll or for other resources that are needed for an event, and you're waiting on event registration revenue to come in. So opening up a credit line could be another option in terms of financing. And then there are investments that can get a little more complicated, and oftentimes larger nonprofits will look into investments, although I think Kevin is going to next kind of highlight some case studies that where there are other opportunities to tap into investments. So we can look at stocks and investing in stocks and bonds. Nonprofits are able to participate in the financial market. It of course needs to, as with your board being having fiduciary responsibility, checking in with your board members. It of course needs to comply with government regulations as a nonprofit, but for nonprofits, investing in stocks and bonds, you actually get a tax-free return on any profit that you're making from your initial investment. Endowments are also interesting, again, more commonly for larger nonprofits, but there is some potential here too. This is where maybe there's a large donation sum that comes in, and then you invest that principal into various investments, and then endowments are essentially continuously growing pots of funding. Typically, the principal that's invested doesn't get tapped, and then the portion of the profit will be split between being reinvested and then withdrawn to fund whatever operations or program expenses that you might have. Real estate investments are also another opportunity, and then even equipment rentals, or if you have a conference room that you want to rent out, or if you have certain types of equipment or materials that you're interested in renting, that could be another way in which you can think about generating revenue. And then finally, with financial incentives, so there are various rebates and incentives available through programs run by state agencies and with approved financial institutions. Also, like utilities, local and regional agencies sometimes provide rebates and incentives. Typically, these will be for like hard costs, like implementation costs. So retrofitting buildings and installing energy efficient equipment or solutions, equipment purchases such as electric vehicles. So this could be a way in which you're reducing costs and taking advantage of those incentives. You can also look at residential incentives as a way to tap into available financing for your community members. And then it's not necessarily like funding your organization's operations or programs, but it could help to further your mission or have a larger impact. So overall, I think there are pros and cons to funding and financing, of course. With funding, doesn't have to be repaid. You can get larger grants. I think the challenge there is, of course, funder priorities could change. So if you're only reliant on grants, that could be a bit riskier. The administrative and reporting requirements could be rather burdensome. And of course, you're not getting paid to apply and create your application. So that could also take some time. and then depending on like the overall competitiveness of the grant program. For financing, I think the pros there, money can be provided upfront and quickly. I know, combining funding and financing could be interesting in that with many grant programs, they're set up on a reimbursement basis. So potentially financing can come in to provide more immediate money and upfront. It can help to accelerate implementation. It can help to fund larger projects. The cons, of course, is going to be repayment, and depending on the terms, the added cost to the effort overall. A business case will likely be needed to tap into certain financing mechanisms, since unfortunately, oftentimes financing mechanisms don't capture full social impacts and the benefits there. And then also with like investments needing that upfront capital in order to tap into that. So oftentimes, the best way to go is to tap into multiple sources. I think most nonprofits and community-based organizations are going to be primarily funded through different funding avenues. But there could be some financing strategies that you consider to then bring in some additional revenue. There are other ways that you could reduce costs. Group purchasing is a potential. Working with vendors, working with your partners when you reach out to a vendor, if you have common needs, if there's a better rate that you can get. A lot of local governments actually have cooperative agreements around joint purchasing. You can also look at in-kind donations if you're looking for certain materials, event space, especially as a nonprofit. Folks, there are like some facilities where vendors will provide in-kind donations. Pro bono support could be another option if you don't have that capacity in-house. Are you looking for legal expertise, funding or financing expertise? Taking advantage of nonprofit discounts where you can, whether that's a tool subscription or with a vendor. You can also look at building capacity to then increase efficiency and impact. Are there systems and procedures you can put into place in how you operate internally that can then increase efficiency or find ways to have larger impact? Automation could be another way to look into things, and this might be an area where you have some in-house expertise or getting some pro bono support to set up some automation so that your staff time is going towards areas where they have a lot of strengths in and more focused on impact and less so on some of the more mundane but necessary administrative tasks that we all have to do. And then engaging your board members and other partners to help connect you with other funders and to bring in sponsorships and provide support letters and just support your overall funding strategy. And I think overall, another thing to consider is accurate project planning. I think this is certainly relevant for both on the funding and the financing side. If you're looking at funding and applying to a grant, certainly don't want to overpromise on all of these deliverables because you want to be as competitive as possible, and then get into a position where you might not actually have all the resources to complete all those deliverables. So accurate project planning can certainly be helpful, and of course on the financing side if you're looking at repayment. So I will wrap up there.
Okay, so this is one of the themes. So there's a tremendous amount of rhetoric out there around the billions or trillions of dollars that will be mobilized around climate finance. Here from the pages of business as usual exploitation economy periodicals like Forbes or the Wall Street Journal. And one can get the impression that, wow, there's this tremendous amount of resource that's going to be mobilized around climate. But if you're feeling cynical about it, I would advocate that your skepticism is well justified. And I want to describe why I think that there's a dizzying array of finance that already is flowing into climate, but I want to kind of highlight, this is the kind of from a couple of years ago, about $600 billion globally kind of going into climate from a finance perspective. But most of that is going towards the red circle there, towards what this titled mitigation. And in fact, most of that mitigation is diversified renewable energy and transportation type stuff. Why is that? Why is the adaptation stuff that sometimes directly addresses community living needs, why is that such a small piece of pie? And why is anything that integrates like land use or our strategies that stack functions with our partnership with nature, why is that such a small percentage? And I think that you probably already know this, but one of the reasons is finance is largely stuck in the business as usual paradigm of perceived risk and return, but not real risk, not risk to life and human life or other than human life, but financial risk. So this question of like finance flows to where it can conform to the market rate return expectations that capitalism has predetermined. This is what capital does in finance. And that's incredibly frustrating, disappointing, and sad as well. And the consequence, of course, is that we're not even close globally to having the adequate amount of finance flowing into climate solutions to be even near a target for a livable future for our children and grandchildren and our communities. We're tracking around $700 billion when it needs to be in the trillions every year by all projections. And so as we all know here, the actual risks to life are already unbearable for communities on the front lines, and those risks are likely to increase. So when I say it's good to be skeptical and cynical, it's also true that we are likely to see billions and then trillions of dollars deployed over the next decade. But I personally have little faith in the business as usual institutions of finance to mobilize it to the places where it's most needed. So I want to encourage you to look at two trends that I think are really important looking at both climate funding and climate finance, is this idea of where is there community control? And also this, like Julia mentioned, this kind of cobbling together this integrated approach, sometimes called integrated capital or integrated finance or blended capital. How can we use multiple different types of resource, bring it together? And sometimes that has consequences for multiple types of entities. So I'm going to talk about two case studies real quickly outside of the US context, outside of the California context, and then we're going to go into breakout groups and an exercise on some California case stories and some analysis there to look at some of these themes. And as we do go into any of these case stories, I encourage you to look at who's controlling the finance, who's making the decisions around it, and also what are the creative strategies around multiple integrations of different types of entities, different types of capital sources, and how is it all pooled together? Those are things that I think are important to look at. The Boston Ujima project, I'm deeply inspired by what they're doing. They've raised a multi-million-dollar community capital fund raised by the community from multiple stakeholders. So the millions of dollars have come from the community itself in increments as small as $10 here, $50 there, $100, and also from private philanthropy, where it's $1 million or $2 million type of gifts into this capital fund. But the way they structured it as an entity is that no matter if you put in $10 or $1 million, you have the same power in terms of deciding where the funds go, under what terms the funds are deployed, zero interest loans or non-extractive type of lending facilities, or a blend of philanthropic funding as well as finance, and what standards the fund recipients need to uphold with regards to their project. A lot of the projects of the Boston Ujima project are dedicated to self-determined community economic sovereignty, which is obviously really important for capacity building to be able to plan for climate equity solutions. And some of the things that are receiving funding or on the potential to receive funding are directly related to climate equity strategies within the community in Boston. And so I believe that Boston Ujima is an example of a model of the type of project that could be really important, where there's a community voice and community control in where finance goes, which is much more likely to lead to better outcomes than market rate return capital. On the project side, that's an example of the funding side. On the project side, I wanted to highlight a case study that is utilizing an integrated capital stack and actually multiple entities as well. Nonprofits, producer cooperatives incubated within a nonprofit context, and community-based organizations. This is a picture of Winona LeDuc, of the Ojibwa and Anishinaabe people in the White Earth Nation. And she's envisioned this industrial hemp, a growing, processing, and value-added economic development project with the vision of creating economic capacity and wealth building for the White Earth Nation in Minnesota. So it turns out that Minnesota is a great region for growing industrial hemp and was the second largest hemp growing region on this continent before hemp was put into prohibition. And so, Winona saw this opportunity to leverage the soils and any of the existing industrial processing capacity that, even if it's dilapidated from the 40s, that to create this kind of vertically integrated, which I'll describe if that term is unfamiliar to you, for the community of Indigenous farmers, a vertically integrated enterprise incubated in the Anishinaabe Agriculture Institute, a nonprofit, as an economic model, with the idea of the model being a regional replicable model for other tribal nations in this continent to develop a seed to garment industrial hemp textile industry. And so she's been growing hemp for a few years now and has applied for and received grants from the state of Minnesota, from the federal government through the USDA, and from private foundations. And the funding that she gathered for the grow operations came under like food security projects, economic development, agriculture, jobs and skills development, and most recently a carbon sequestration, regenerative organic agriculture practice development for different types of crops in addition to hemp. And so this very creative, looking at different ways to get resources in this broader vision, which is a multi-year vision to take hemp from a seed or a plant all the way into high quality garments and textiles, whole cloth and clothing. And it turns out that to take hemp from a seed to clothing involves a lot of steps and a lot of processing. And so Winona's vision was, well, let's actually incubate enterprises that can be cooperatively owned by the farmers and the community to create a reliable long-term financing mechanism internal to the tribal nation, so that by developing these enterprises, that they would then generate profit, and that profit would be supportive of both wealth building for the community, but also all of their nonprofit climate equity endeavors and additional just transition projects. All this in the context of fighting pipelines, like Line 3, as Winona is literally today doing that, literally today. All these steps require some research and development and fundraising, and so the capital, the finance that Winona has, put together includes, private philanthropy, some from foundations. I mentioned some of the government grants as well, and then some recoverable grants, which, like Julia mentioned, some loans can be paid back at like zero interest type structures, and sometimes they come from foundations or from philanthropic pools, and sometimes zero interest loans can come from not necessarily from philanthropic pools, but from a community finance pool. And the idea here is to actually develop the enterprises to a point where they will actually receive grant funding, and the equity, the ownership of the enterprises that would be incubated and then owned by the nonprofit, so cooperative owned by the nonprofit, all of the profits that the cooperative would own would flow to the producers, the growers, on the White Earth Nation land, the indigenous growers, as well as any additional profits would go to support additional just transition projects from the nonprofit context. So that, I hope the vertically integrated, I said I'd explain that term. The idea there is that instead of sending the hemp from the growing operation to some of these processing steps like decortication and degumming and refining, all the way to get to whole cloth and a garment, that would be stacked in one place, literally in Minnesota over time, that those pieces would all be owned by the same kind of cooperative entity, so that the profit doesn't have to be split. It can be shared by the White Earth Nation. And Winona sometimes refers to this vision as the hempire, with the ultimate vision that what if clothing that we wear could be increasing biodiversity, sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere, and providing economic self-determination for indigenous peoples as a model that could be replicated all over this continent. So just an example of a case story, pretty grand in vision, but very creative in leveraging kind of this integrated capital type of approach. Can you tell me if anything's coming up in the chat, any questions, or if we're ready to go to the additional California case stories?
Just a lot of love for Winona.
So another somewhat dry presentation from me. I apologize, but to go over the state budgeting process. So each year, the budgeting process starts in January when the governor releases the budget proposal. So even though like formally it launches in January, I mean, the work gets underway, probably like in October, some of those conversations start to happen where the governor will hear from his advisors and kind of, start pulling that proposal together. But January is when the budget proposal is released, and soon after, the Legislative Analyst Office, or the LAO, will review the proposal and kind of release an analysis. From there, the legislature will introduce a budget bill, essentially kind of translating some like the proposal into bill form, and then starting to convene. The budget committees will start to convene and start to like make amendments to the actual bill. The conversations that take place at this stage, no major decisions are made, but oftentimes the budget committees and the subcommittees, there are like 5 or 6 standing committees for the Assembly and then the Senate budget committees. They'll start to look at the Legislative Analyst Office, their analysis, look at some of the issues that are raised, consider the issues that they've heard from the public, from their staff, the issues that, the legislative members who sit on those committees, kind of the issues that they're focused on and championing. And then in May, the governor will release the May budget revise. So this is a more accurate picture of the budget. This takes into account like recent months of spending and revenue, so there's a clear picture of what the state has to work with. And the state operates on a fiscal year with a July 1st start and July 30th. So a clear picture in May. The budget committees are continuing to convene. They're holding hearings. The subcommittees are holding hearings. This is where the kind of deliberations in committees are kind of really taking shape and happening in earnest. They're really getting into the details and trying to figure out what they want to propose and what they want to change in the bill itself. There are negotiations that take place as well between the Assembly and the Senate, as well as with the governor, to try to work out any disagreements between the governor's proposal and what the legislature is wanting to propose. From there are a couple of deadlines that are recently that have passed and are coming up. So by June 15th, the legislature each year needs to pass the budget bill. If they don't get paid. So legislators take that take that deadline pretty seriously. I think in recent years, the budget has been passing on time, and it gets passed by a simple majority. And then the governor has to sign the budget to approve it and adopt it by July 1st is the deadline there. The governor does have some veto power where he could strike out certain lines that are of expenditures that are proposed, but some of the more directive language can't be changed at this stage. And then there's of course a process in place with 2/3 majority. The veto could be overridden. From there are also budget trailer bills that are really important, and these can be adopted. It doesn't follow this the January through July budget timeline. It really follows the legislative timeline. These are trailer bills that could be really passed at any point when a bill is adopted or when a bill is passed. And this is where there will be more specific provisions and allocations for the bigger buckets of funding that are approved in the budget. Yeah, it's really kind of spelling out the details of the expenditures that are included in that main budget. And the deadlines are, I'll have to look at the actual calendar, that's totally my bad. Mid-September, I believe it's going to be the deadline for the legislature to pass any bill. And then in October, there's a deadline for the governor to sign that bill into law. There is a more detailed process. I just wanted to give a very high-level overview. I actually can't access the chat window. Let me pop that into chat super quick, or actually if someone from the team, if you're in the internal agenda, I can't find my chat window. Oh, there we go. Sorry, it was hiding. So there we go. That is a more detailed overview of the process. If you're interested in digging a little deeper, let me get back to it. So, don't mind me navigating Zoom. Here we go. So where are we at currently? The legislature last Monday, just the 14th, so right before the deadline, passed the budget bill. The budget bill is AB 128. It is rather long. I will send that in the chat function. I definitely recommend hitting that Control F and using the search function. We can also, there are also summaries that are produced that I can share via chat after this presentation. So the governor will have until July 1st to sign the budget bill, but it's really considered a placeholder budget in a lot of ways because the negotiations will continue in terms of specific allocations. So that's where advocacy can really come in at this stage. I mean, honestly, advocacy can be happening, throughout this entire process, but there is a unique opportunity right now and likely over the summer. To be honest, these negotiations could be resolved at any point, but it's unlikely that things won't get settled until after folks return from summer recess. So sometime in mid-August is when folks will be returning. So over the next couple of months, we have a really great opportunity for advocacy for all of you if you're interested in engaging in this process and sharing about and making sure that your priorities are heard. So a few kind of general advocacy avenues, essentially contacting your legislator, committee members, and committee staff, thinking about the legislator in your district, also considering the specific legislative members who are on the budget committees and the various subcommittees. So you might be interested in looking at the subcommittee focused on the environment. The budget committees also have staff assigned, and subcommittees also have staff. So the links provided in this presentation go to the page for the Assembly Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee, where you can see who the legislators are who sit on those committees, as well as contact information for the committee staff if you want to reach out. So commonly, comment letters are going to be a main avenue for sharing your priorities, and then also providing public testimony at committee hearings and subcommittee hearings. Of course, there's power in numbers. So working with your network, working with your partners and allies to conducting joint advocacy can be a more effective way to have your priorities heard. So generally, what does that look like? Kind of convening your key stakeholders. Who are your key partners and allies who have shared goals? Also thinking about who legislators can be like more influenced by in some ways. Unfortunately, with the reality, definitely community-based organizations, having your voice heard is important. A lot of legislators also want to hear from like local governments, local elected officials. So having those relationships built, or even using this as an opportunity to build those relationships, I think could be an avenue to pursue. Also thinking about bringing together a broad coalition of stakeholders that serve different communities, that work in different sectors, professional associations, universities, what have you. I think a multi-sector, multidisciplinary coalition can be really powerful. It's also, I think I already noted this, but seeing who specifically sits on the budget committees are important. The Senate Pro Tem and the Assembly Speaker also will have major roles to play. So they also want to hear from folks in their districts. So this is where a statewide network like this can really come into play, identifying like where those senators and assembly members, where their districts are, and then working with partners there to align some advocacy efforts. So want to define some shared priorities. This is where things can sometimes get tricky. Other times things can flow really smoothly. Oftentimes you have partnerships and allies where your priorities are very much so aligned, and speaking to those shared funding priorities in your joint comment letter or however you're advocating will be important. Kind of keeping things at a high. Typically, comment letters are going to be at a higher level, although with this current opportunity to inform more specific program allocations for climate, it might be worth actually digging a little deeper into the details of specific programs that you want to advocate for to receive continued funding or additional funding or additional investments that you'd like to see made. And then also thinking about the messaging strategies that you'll want to use so that you're kind of on the same page, you're staying focused on your agenda, and you're communicating your priorities in a compelling way. And then from there, essentially coordinating those efforts. I think y'all play that facilitator coordinator role likely in different circles. So, having someone who is kind of that central coordinator is useful and can help to make coordination flow a bit more smoothly. So organizing comment letters, using Google Forms is a great way to get sign-ons, I will admit. There's a way where you can have folks upload their logos, you keep everything in one place, export the results into a Google Sheet, and you can keep track of who you're adding into the letter. Oftentimes you'll also see like multiple versions of the same letter with additional signatories going out. Something to consider in terms of timing for comment letters, and this is particularly important, I think, leading up to the June-July deadlines is when those budget committee hearings are taking place. This is also relevant for legislative matters overall. If there's a certain bill that you're advocating for, looking to see what is the current status of that bill, what committee is it currently in, when is that committee hearing scheduled, reaching out to committee staff to see, when do they want to receive committee comment letters by. Some committees are super easy to follow online. Like they'll have all of the information posted on their webpage. They'll specify when they want to receive comment letters. Other times you'll have to do a little digging and some outreach to see kind of when you should try to send your letter in by. Typically, like at least a few days before the committee hearing is scheduled is always best to try to send the letter in. And copying committee staff is always a good idea to make sure that staff level folks see it, and it's not just going to legislators and getting lost in their inbox. You can also coordinate with your partners to actually attend the committee hearings and provide public testimony. There are some different procedures now with COVID. I believe they also have like an online platform where you can submit written comments. You can also call in to provide verbal comments. It also varies by committee hearing, depending on what they have on the docket and what they have time for in terms of time for public comment. So I'll stop there. Super quick rundown, just kind of touching on it at a high level. I think on the advocacy side, I would love to dive into that a bit further with folks, maybe in a future session or as part of phase 2. But with that, Coral, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you to everybody who shared so far today. So today I'm going to be covering cap and trade and the programs funded through it, the California Climate Investments Program. I do know that maybe we shouldn't have put this last. It's maybe going to be a little more of a downer compared to some of these others, but I think it's really, really important that everybody understands and has all the information on how the system came to be, how it works, and kind of the process and the cycles that go through it so that you are better informed in how to engage in it. So Natalie, would you still be able to share slides? If not, I can work on it. Okay, so like I said, covering cap and trade and the programs funded through it, the California Climate Investments Program. So taking it way back to 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger and the legislature passed AB 32, which said that the state had to reduce greenhouse gas emission levels in the state to the levels they were at in 1990 by the year 2020. And so they also said that this had to be done through the creation of a cap and trade program, which I'll kind of explain in a moment. And it also directed that any funds raised through the cap and trade program had to be spent on projects that further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So they mandated the Air Resources Board to create a scoping plan, which develops a method to achieve that target of 1990 levels by 2020. And they came up with the California Climate Investments vision of funding programs across sectors that are known to produce emissions. So energy, transportation, agriculture, for example. And then next slide, please. So I want to really quickly give an overview of how the cap and trade system works, because I think it's often talked about, but there isn't necessarily an explanation of how it functions. So it's creating a capitalist market for pollution. The state sets an initial limit or cap on overall emissions that they use to decide how much polluters, which are called covered entities, you might hear that word sometimes, can pollute, as well as how many pollution credits are available. So in this bar graph, if you just kind of ignore the little red column at the top, the green and the yellow are the allowances that the state is giving to polluters, those covered entities, and the blue is the amount that they have that they're holding for auctions. So if a covered entity wants to emit more than the state says they can buy pollution credits in an auction. So the way this works is if there was a business that was covered under cap and trade, they're part of this system, the state might say, you have allowances to emit 50,000 metric tons of emissions a year, but they currently were operating at 75,000. They could either go to this auction and purchase the credits and bid for them, or they could find ways to reduce their emissions in their operating practices. So just like any other auction within a capitalist market that's created, the more desirable the thing is to the people who are bidding, the more money will be raised. So the price of those credits fluctuates with the demand. And when the demand for polluting is high, that means the state is going to raise a lot of money from those auctions. The idea being that there will be this cap that starts out, you see at 400 million allowances, goes down to 200 by 2030. So there's that gradual reduction. Next slide, please. So the state holds these auctions on a quarterly basis to allow polluters to purchase these pollution credits. And that goes into what is known as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. To date, this has raised $15 billion, so a huge amount of money. These proceeds then are turned into funding for the California climate investment programs. So that set of programs that I mentioned, the 30 plus programs, I'll get into some of those in a moment. And obviously a major issue that people have raised since the beginning of cap and trade and continue to is that the program doesn't require polluters to reduce emissions across the board. And so what this means is that environmental justice communities that live near often multiple large sources of pollution don't have a change in their lived outcomes if those polluters don't choose to reduce their emissions. So from an environmental justice perspective, it does not address the harms that have been done, continue to be done to communities, as we all know, and even if overall emissions are going down in the state. So when cap and trade, it was clear that it was going to be the direction that the state was going in. Environmental justice groups pushed really hard to make sure that if this program is going to exist, at least the money raised from it should be going back into our communities. And so this led to the passage of Senate Bill 535 in 2012, which required that at least 25% of the funds be spent in quote unquote disadvantaged communities. Going way back to the Cal EnviroScreen training, that is the tool that's used to designate disadvantaged communities. A few years later, legislation was also added, Assembly Bill 1550, saying that additional investments from the fund had to be made in communities that are low income and don't show up as disadvantaged in Cal EnviroScreen. Next slide, please. So the 30 programs funded under cap and trade, the climate investment programs, are split into these three categories. They're transportation sustainable communities, clean energy, natural resources, and waste diversion. Some of these programs receive funding every single year without having to go through any sort of process, but some are annually decided in that budget process that Julia was describing. Next slide, please. So you'll actually see that in this pie chart, the only section in dark blue, only the section in dark blue, 40% of the proceeds are decided annually. So 60% of the money coming in from cap and trade is already decided in law. There's going to be a certain amount going to these programs. A lot on transportation. I think Kevin pointed out earlier, there's a lot going to transportation mitigation projects. And again, I think all of the, yes, so many acronyms. I can explain any of these in a minute. I just want to make sure we don't run out of time with me spelling out LCTOP. So yeah, point being that there is only 40% decided every year in the budget process. I'm going to really quickly run through these. I mostly wanted to include these snapshots so that there is a place you can come back to these slides or the recording to pause and take a look at what's been funded by the state. So there's a whole bunch of agencies that administer these funds, although CARB kind of oversees, the Air Resources Board kind of oversees the broad guidance around them. This chart shows the cumulative appropriations, so the total amount of money going to each program before 2020/2021, the amount allocated in 2020/2021, and then the amount cumulative to date. And so this is pulled from the most recent annual report that the Air Resources Board did on how the funding is being spent. You'll see reflected in this budget, it's very much a COVID wildfire year when you look at what has been funded. So I'm going to just run through the next slide, please, really quickly. You'll see some forest and fire prevention in this last year. Next slide, please. I put little stars next to the programs I talked about earlier that are continuously appropriated and don't have to go through that process. So you can see High-speed rail got 247 million out of the cap and trade system last year. Next slide, please. Again, continuously appropriated programs getting a pretty large chunk of money. There was some to safe and affordable drinking water, as well as workforce development, and a little bit on climate resilience planning. And a total, you can see here, of almost 14 billion over the last several years since cap and trade has existed that has been raised in this process. Next slide, please. So just wanted to make a quick kind of high level note. Like Julie mentioned, the budget is supposed to pass by June 15th. That's all the money that's coming out of what's called the general fund, which is typically people's taxes or businesses' taxes. But the budget for these programs coming out of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, aka the cap and trade auctions, is passed later in the summer. So there's a different process that's gone through to decide those, and there's often a little more time for advocacy and figuring out with the legislature and the governor what is actually going to be funded from year to year in that 40% that gets discussed. Next slide, please. Okay, finally, just wanted to note that in 2017, the legislature and governor extended the cap and trade system to 2030. The new goal is to hit 40% of 1990 levels by 2030. And then there's also, because of the way it was passed, some kind of wonky stuff there, an expansion of the eligible use of funds that's now available. So things like technical assistance, planning for the prevention of displacement, workforce development are now eligible costs under the cap and trade funded programs. So I know that was a lot. I know the sky like very smoggy in that photo. If folks want to just like kind of take a breath and take a moment before moving on to the next section, I know it's a little heavy and there's a lot of emotions sometimes around this topic before we transition into the next thing. We take a moment for that. And exhale. Okay, I think with that we can transition into some planning for our.
My name is Ginny Brown. I was for 7 years a staff member with an organization called the Participatory Budgeting Project. My background is in a combination of community organizing, community development, and labor. But I also have a master's in urban planning. And what's funny is that EE reached out to me to connect with this cohort around PB and my experience with participatory budgeting. And just a couple months ago, I joined an equity-oriented planning firm called Estelano Advisors. And my colleagues actually have worked for a long time on strategic growth councils, climate investment programs, and there's just a lot of cross-pollination here. So it's just fun to continually see how things kind of come full circle. Natalie, that is so wonderful to hear. I'm actually EA's only staff person in the Bay Area right now, and we're going to be building a team up here. So I'm very excited to follow up with folks on this call. Please, send us your organizers, send us your radical planners. But that's not why I'm here today. So I also want to briefly pass it over to my former colleague, former ED, and dear friend Sherry Davis, who will talk a little bit more about the organization and their role. But Sherry, do you want to give a quick shout out and hello?
Sure, that was a lot of former, Ginny. I'm still moving through my feelings about that, but we are currently amazing friends and colleagues. Everybody, my name is Sherry Davis. I serve as co-executive director at the Participatory Budgeting Project. Ginny actually was one of the folks that onboarded me when I joined PBP 5 years ago, after spending some time working in government, really trying to break all the rules and let community members decide things. And I had an opportunity to help the city of Boston run their first youth-focused participatory budgeting effort, where young people between the ages of 12 and 25 decided on $1 million of the city of Boston's capital budget. I fell in love with the work. I joined forces with Ginny. She taught me even more about participatory budgeting that we'll share with y'all shortly. And now we're continuing to really think about how we dismantle oppressive systems and build power. I was really feeling that, what did y'all call it? The embodiment of power. I was really feeling that. It feels really ripe for the conversation that we're going to have today.
Awesome. Thanks, Sherry. And again, just so much gratitude to you all for giving us this space today to share some of our experiences and also get to hear a little bit about yours. So, quick overview of our agenda. I believe we have overall about 45 minutes for this conversation. We wanted to do some basic overview of what participatory budgeting is and what it isn't. In our experience, what we've heard is that, especially when we talk to elected officials, everyone loves to say, oh, participatory budgeting, I do that. You know, I just had a conversation with one of my constituents about what they think about my votes on the budget and what I should do. So I do participatory budgeting. And so we want to be clear about what we mean and what we don't mean when we talk about this model. We'd love to share some case studies, some examples of how PB has worked in the US and in California. And we absolutely want to share some stories of how participatory budgeting has been used as a tool by broader movements for justice and in some really specific campaigns around things like defunding the police, around environmental justice, around lifting up youth voice in the city. So we'll be going over some of those case studies and some of those stories and a little bit about our PBP's own internal model of participatory budgeting and what that can look like within organizations. And then just hope, to set aside a good chunk of time for some rich discussion, hear some of your reflections, really eager to hear how this model seems relevant to your work and to the work that this group is doing.
To Ginny's point, though, the Participatory Budgeting Project is a national nonprofit that is about 10 years new. And participatory budgeting as a practice is also about 10 years new in the United States. And so as we talk about this, keep in mind that participatory budgeting as a practice globally has been around for about 30 or so years. And we can talk about some different models. Our presentation today will focus primarily on instances in the United States, but if folks have questions, we can also point you to some additional resources and we can talk about some other examples if that's helpful. Organizationally, PBP is kind of focused on empowering community members, really not empowering, but really acknowledging that community members can directly decide how to spend public money and really being able to build together an infrastructure, a customized infrastructure, whether that's in a school or a community or an entire city, so that it works, so that community members can make direct decisions about budgets. We mostly work in the United States and a touch in Canada. Maybe y'all have seen the ladder of participation, Sherry Arnstein's ladder. This is an adapted version we're calling for today's purposes, the ladder of budget decision making. And if you've seen a version of this ladder before, just put the number 1 in the chat. If this is completely new to you, you're like, I've never seen this ladder before, just put the number 2 in the chat. Good. Thank you so much, y'all. Okay, so we have some folks that are like newer to this ladder, and we have some old, maybe experts, folks that have seen this ladder before. So as I'm talking, if something really stands out to you, or if you want to contribute a thought, go ahead and drop that in the chat as well. But generally, when we talk about community decision-making, folks have an experience that's really on the bottom rung of this ladder. Maybe they have an opportunity to hear something. Maybe they're like literally going to like a hearing or a deputation or community meeting that really looks like a lot of listening. Now, in the grand scheme of decision-making, receiving information is important, but not having an opportunity to contribute in shaping the decision is where that bottom rung of the ladder often lives. And often that's what community has exposure to. That's where folks, majority of people kind of exist in terms of their relationship to government or government decision-making. organizational decision-making often. When you start moving up the rungs of this ladder, though, that changes. And so when you move up another rung, we see this really cool thing. It's more interactive. It's more informative. Maybe it's like an online game or interactive zine or application that allows you to learn more about information, maybe provides accessible data, but still doesn't allow community members to participate in a shared decision. If you march up the ladder even further, I get to this spot that folks really get excited about, focus groups and town halls. This is important, right? Community members are often able to provide recommendations in this space, really important insights. They kind of act as consultants. The challenge here is the return on your investment, the return on your time for like a single parent, for example, that goes down to a community meeting or focus group is not clear. So you might participate, and you may participate in several surveys. And I think as already has come up in our conversation today, a decision may be made that has nothing to do with your input. And I think that's a regular thing that we see with town halls and focus groups. Sometimes it can feel like checking a box, but there's no real opportunity for community members to participate in decision making. So as you march up the ladder even further and you get to this space of limited participation, now, there is some decision making here, right? When you move away from often the tokenism, thank you for shouting that out, of focus groups and town halls into the board or councils, there's some decision making that happens. There's usually a group of somewhere between 8 and, I don't know, 40 individuals that sit on a board or council. They have the ability to make some really important decisions. This is fantastic. But what happens to everybody else? Well, those are examples of full participation. An example of full participation is participatory budgeting, when there's a broader opportunity, not for just a recommendation, but for dialogue, discussion, and for an actual decision to be made by broader community, however community is described. And so as we get further into participatory budgeting, we're talking about a democratic process in which community members directly decide how to spend a portion of a public budget. Ginny, why don't you tell the folks how exactly that happens?
Yep, thanks, Sherry. So as Sherry said, PB is a process in which community members directly decide how to spend a portion of a public budget. And one thing to mention at the outset is that doing participatory budgeting does not require new money. Frequently, particularly in the early days after the city of Vallejo started its PB process, I would often hear from people in government that they don't have extra money, and so they can't do participatory budgeting. And we really like to just try and hit home the point that PB is not about finding new money. It's about a different way of deciding how to spend funds that already exist. So I think the caveat and the important thing to note there is to be clear that there is discretion in how that money can be spent, and to understand from the outset what, if any, constraints do exist around those funds. So the process starts with a pot of money set aside, and the entity that has ultimate kind of fiduciary responsibility over those funds agrees to go through the process and uphold what comes out of it, agrees to set aside decision-making power over the funds to participants in the PB process. And the first thing that happens when a pot of money is allocated is to convene a steering committee that represents the broad diversity of a given city or a given community or institution in which the process is happening, but especially, first and foremost, must have representatives that are rooted in and that represent communities that have historically been excluded from decision-making about public budgets. So Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, working class communities, immigrant communities, young people organizations that work with folks with disabilities. Those are the people who come together as a steering committee to oversee the process and make key decisions about how it's going to work. So, who should be eligible, to participate in what ways, who should be eligible to vote? Is there a, minimum voting age? Where and how should outreach happen to ensure that engagement is equitable and inclusive? And then to meet over the course of the process to continue reflecting on, how is engagement looking? Are we reaching people that, are not the usual suspects? How are we going to shift our engagement strategy to reach them, and make some key decisions that come up over the course of the process? So the first public phase is brainstorming ideas. People come together in community assemblies, at community meetings, to talk about the needs in their community, to learn about what the pot of money is on the table, what it can fund, what it can't fund, and then to talk about how they want to see this money spent in order to meet the most pressing needs in the community. From there, a smaller number of people sign up to serve as, sometimes we call them budget delegates, sometimes we call them change agents, but to work in smaller committees. These may be issue-based committees focused on public health, on small businesses and workforce, on housing and homelessness. They may be demographic committees. If we're working in a community with, 3 major language groups, we've had in Oakland when we did PB, we had a Spanish language committee. We had a Chinese speaking committee with both interpretation in Mandarin and Cantonese. And those folks really go out and do the research based on all the ideas that came out of the assemblies to identify, okay, what is most needed. They talk to folks in government to learn what's already planned. How do these ideas that came out of the community align with what may already be in the pipeline, and go through some really rigorous equity criteria to determine which are the most important and which are the most needed that should move forward to the ballot. Those then get submitted to, if it's a city, to city departments to make sure that the price is accurate, that everything is, meeting the guidelines of legal and, within regulations, to ensure that nothing goes on the ballot that is not ready to be implemented by government. So finally, you go back out to the community and people get to vote on which projects should ultimately be funded and implemented. Because PB is a community-led process, this vote is not run by a county, board of elections. It can take place in outside grocery stores, in senior centers, in schools. People can vote, across the spectrum of age, of citizenship, and generally the way that the vote works is that the projects that get the most votes up to the pot of money are then implemented by local government, and people get to see their ideas become reality. And then the process starts again the next year with ongoing monitoring and evaluation of the projects that were funded to ensure that if any barriers come up, that the community is also still part of the conversation to address those barriers should they come up in implementation. Sherry, you can go to the next slide.
I just want to say that Ileana had a question. I think she had her hand raised.
Oh, so sorry, I couldn't see that. Yes, go right ahead.
It was towards the beginning when you were talking about creating a steering committee.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, like, what your experiences with that structure have been. There's been some talk in the chat about how maybe sometimes, if the members of the steering committee are the same as always, it might be difficult to make any kind of effective change, and it seems like the membership on that committee is very crucial. So I was just wondering, what have you found to be the most effective ways to really not have the same cast of characters, so that it's a true cast, so it's a true power distribution or a true representation. And then you mentioned as part of those strategies is involving people from all aspects of, or all sectors of the community. And I'm wondering, have you found that to be effective and feasible? Because if I think about taking this back to my community, like, so many of the people that I would want to be on the steering committee are working multiple jobs, are seasonal low-wage earners, are are barely earning a living wage. And so how are they going to make the time to be able to participate in something like this. So I'm just seeing a high barrier to entry, and I'm wondering, what do you do to democratize those seats and that power?
Such a good question. Jenny, maybe I could jump in a bit here.
Go for it.
The short answer is, this is why we design like with and kind of not for. And in the best instances that I've seen, getting specific about what we mean by impacted community has been really helpful in developing a diverse steering committee of designers that are community experts. And so just to give a concrete example, we're going to do case studies in a second, but just to give a concrete example, oftentimes when we run a PB process, it may be connected to a specific section of a budget. It may be connected to a topical area like safety. It may be connected to, in the city of Boston, it was a broader effort to improve the quality of life for young people. But in most PB that I've been involved in the United States, it's had a component of equity that has required some specific naming of impacted groups. And so in Boston, that meant folks from 5 historically marginalized neighborhoods, young people that identified as houseless, individuals that were currently and formerly incarcerated, and those that were part of the LGBTQIA community. And so the steering committee, and there was a lot of intention and planning in this, actually represented, or not represented, included individuals that were from those groups. And then the question becomes, well, these folks like experience maybe some barriers, right? Or they have like a lot going on. So how do we ensure that the process is right for them? And it doesn't happen overnight. And the short answer is we ask. So community members have said, like, we can't meet on Tuesday nights. We really need to provide food at the meetings. Childcare is essential. And I'm giving this longer example because I think it's 100% possible. And often the biggest mistake that I see when folks are trying to move a PB process is they're expecting it to be able to begin and conclude in a week or a month. And the planning and deep engagement that Ginny and I are talking about is often a months-long process that includes meeting people where they are, and most importantly, letting them tell you where to meet them. Sometimes we pay the steering committee for their time. There can be steering committee co-chairs. In the instance of Boston, I launched this when I was running the City of Boston's youth employment program. So we actually created youth jobs so that young people could support various elements of this. That was a pretty unique instance. We've seen stipends, we've seen grocery, gift cards, we've seen a variety of, I want to say incentives, but a variety of like community support for participation.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things I've seen too is, so the organization I work for is trying to form a board of directors that is more representative of the community that we serve. And to address a point about feeling like you're not educated enough, or like you're not, like you don't have the proper qualifications or requirements. One of the things that we do, because we work a lot with low literacy people, is we put all of our reports in video format. So I'm thinking these are the types of strategies that you're discussing, is like thinking through who is going to be on your seat, clearly defining that, having a clear definition that's or like purpose of the steering committee, whether it's youth-based or what have you. And then seeing who needs to be at the table, and then seeing what types of extra support or guidance or accommodations that they might need. And then you have your committee.
That's right. And
so it's not always the same people. Okay.
Exactly. And so you'd often start with a needs assessment, right? Or you might start with some equity mapping data, right? Or you might start with a definition of equity, right? And then you might design with the individuals in mind that can speak to those components. And it includes digestible data, digestible, accessible information.
Now, do you find that often hinders the process, like makes it go slower? Do you need more time for that? Or is it one of those things where you go slow to go fast?
I think it's a little bit of go slow to go fast, but honestly, if I'm being, so y'all, I can't remember if I said this, right? I'm a recovering government employee, right? I worked in local government for nearly 15 years. There was no onboarding, right? I managed a multi-million-dollar budget. There was someone handed me like not even a spreadsheet. It was like a PowerPoint slide that had been passed on for since the beginning of PowerPoint's creation. And yeah, so my point with that is often the folks in government themselves need that digestible data. They're often intimidated themselves with a big spreadsheet. They're often really appreciative when we're able to have these conversations because they have the same questions, right? Like navigating a procurement process is difficult for everyone involved. There are some folks that know how to do it, but the vast majority of people do not. And so the one thing that I would say is people are really smart. And when we're able to have conversations, folks are super capable. They're often able to improve the materials by saying, like, what does this mean? And is this what you're saying? So that's been my experience. I don't think it's been a hindrance, but it has to be intentional.
And I'll just, I feel like both Sherry and I could probably speak on this question of, how to really build a steering committee that is representative, reflective for another like 20 minutes. And a lot of it I think would align with what the experiences are in this room. A couple of quick things that I would say is that overall, when a PB process starts in a community, there is generally buy-in around the idea that the reason you're doing participatory budgeting is to hear from folks who you are not already hearing from and to lift up community voice in a particular budget or around a particular program in a way that is not already happening. And so that really kind of allows those who are there in the beginning of shaping the process to continually ask the question, like, who is not in the room and how do we reach them? And in order to make sure that, we have the knowledge, that we have the experience that we need to reach those communities need to be at the table to shape the process. And so, one thing, sometimes I'll say, sometimes generally there's an open kind of application process for steering committee. And those who oversee the application process often include a combination of groups who were kind of part of pushing for the PB process in the beginning. And one last piece that I'll share from Vallejo is that because that process went through the entire city council in order to get approval, and it was very contentious, the members of the steering committee were actually appointed by the city council. Each city council member got to appoint 3, and the council was split. 4 voted for PB, 3 voted against PB. But those folks who voted against PB, the people that they appointed to the steering committee, those folks, they were responsible for ensuring that this process, really fulfilled the goals that they had set out. And there's a story that I love to share from the writing the rules process in Vallejo, which I'll share very briefly, and then we're going to move on because I know we have about 20 minutes left, I think. And 12 minutes. Great. Okay. I think I'm going to share this story and touch on some of what had been in our upcoming slides. So hopefully we'll cut the presentation short. I'm a community organizer by training. My heart, that's where I come from. And I had expected that the Vallejo steering committee would include organizing groups, base building groups, the way that it did in New York City. Those were the groups that pushed for PB. In Vallejo, those of you who know Vallejo know that the kind of infrastructure of nonprofits is incredibly, incredibly thin. And the organizations that were on the steering committee included the Realtors Association, neighborhood associations, a neighborhood watch group, chambers of commerce, the ethnic chambers of commerce. And during the writing the rules process, We began with a goal setting, and there was broad agreement that everyone wanted the process to engage people who weren't already typically connecting with government and who weren't already involved in the community. Later that night, we had a question come up about voting requirements and who should be eligible to participate, and specifically, should there be a citizenship requirement? Should only citizens be able to vote in this process? And the folks around the table were the representatives from the Chamber of Commerce, the Realtors Association, the Filipino Veterans Association, and a neighborhood association. And at the beginning of the conversation, it was, everyone said, well, obviously we have to go by the rules of typical elections. Those are the rules in this country. You have to be a citizen in order to vote. But what this process allowed me to do was to say, a few minutes ago, you all just set the goal of designing a process that reaches people who aren't already involved and who aren't already showing up to public meetings. What does it look like to set voting rules that would enable you to carry out that vision and to align with that goal? And within 20 minutes, they had all decided and were in unanimous agreement that there should not be a citizenship requirement, because there was at least 15% of their community who they knew may be undocumented or maybe non-citizens. So while we, I think, do PB to open up space for marginalized communities, oppressed communities, and those who've been excluded to really take leadership, I've also seen this really interesting way in which people who are existing leaders in a community engage in PB in a way that really transforms their understanding of who their community is and what it means to lead in that community. So I'm going to stop with that, that story. I think, let's see, Sherry, let's see if we can move quickly through the next couple of slides. So I think this, Sherry, I'm going to pass it off to you in a minute, but one thing I'll say here is that what drew me to participatory budgeting as a model of participatory planning was that, unlike any other model of community engagement that I learned about in planning school, PB really seemed to hold the promise of, when done right, lifting up and centering the needs and the experiences and the wisdom and the leadership of communities that have been most historically excluded from government decision-making about resources. And what we want to be absolutely clear about is that that doesn't just happen. The process needs to be designed in order to center equity. And so there are 5 key features of an equitable design that we wanted to go through briefly, and we've talked about those already. I'm just going to touch on them again. One is money that matters. So ensuring that the money on the table, number one, is enough to actually fund real meaningful projects. And number 2, that it touches on the issues that are most salient in the communities that you're working in and whose leadership you really want to center. In Chicago, the money that was used for PB really could be, it was capital funding, and mostly it could only improve kind of streets and sidewalks. Early on in that process, the demographics of who was showing up to participate skewed much whiter and much more affluent than I think a lot of community organizing groups there were hoping for. In New York, even though they had those same restrictions, it could only be capital funding for infrastructure. Capital funding could be used to improve public housing, and it could be used to improve schools. And what you saw was a lot of organizations that represented public housing residents, a lot of parents groups and a lot of youth groups show up in that process and win a lot of improvement projects in public housing and in schools. So again, thinking about money that matters. The second is rooting the process in grassroots leadership, ensuring that groups representing BIPOC communities, working class immigrant communities, historically marginalized communities are at the table designing the process from the beginning and setting the outreach plan. The third is inclusive design. So actually taking the process to the people. You don't have to hold PB in City Hall. You can hold it again at, adult education centers. You can hold it in schools. In Boston, for the youth process, they did voting at a job fair at a juvenile detention center. So again, this is a community designed and led process that can actually go to where the people are that you're trying to reach. Focused outreach, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I talk about the importance of setting aside a sizable budget to pay community organizations to reach their people and to lead outreach in this process, but paying people, number one, for their time, and paying organizations to actually do outreach in the communities that they're a part of is absolutely critical and a non-negotiable. We have this conversation all the time when we're negotiating project budgets with cities. And then the last is equity criteria. We can talk about this a little bit more, but briefly, in the proposal development process, over the years, we've developed a number of different tools and kind of matrices to really help participants assess who will benefit most from these projects, are they most needed, and how can we ensure that the projects that make it to the ballot are those that are going to provide direct the most resources to the most under-resourced communities.
Just look at this beautiful map populating. This is some of my answer around accountability. So when Ginny showed you this kind of how PB is done, we spent a little bit of time talking about the steering committee. Who designs the process? How do they get set up? What do they do? Do they get paid? What does their labor look like? What does their support look like? The steering committee often acts as a team of ambassadors that engages other folks throughout the process, builds like a broader network of support, accountability, transparency. And so throughout the PB process, this broader network continues to recruit folks, whether that is in ideation or whether that is in proposal development to really get into the weeds and like define proposals. These are all mechanisms of additional accountability that are built in throughout the process. So you have an entire team of folks that's focused on vetting an idea that's turned into a proposal that could be on the ballot. Once the implementation happens, many times we see not only the steering committee, but community at large continue to be engaged and receive updates on the implementation, get engaged directly in the implementation because they're needed to ensure the integrity of the project happens. And sometimes something goes wrong. For example, we were going to do a park renovation. This one, we found out that it was on a site that needed to be protected, like an archaeological site. So we had to halt construction of the park renovation. Community came out and did an archaeological dig with the city's architects, and then we were able to move forward. So what an interesting example of accountability. There are many others. What I will say, just in terms of case study, I'm not going to go through a bunch, but since Divest Invest came up so much, I want to show y'all that. But before I do, I wanted to give you this other really interesting application of participatory budgeting. So we've talked a lot about cities, maybe even counties or districts that are doing PB. Sometimes we see zip codes do PB. Sometimes we see schools do PB. Sometimes we can see entire school districts do participatory budgeting. One of the things that we're working on at PBP, though, is how to broaden capacity for folks to make decisions together about budgets. So one way that we do that is we model some decisions together. We do something called PB squared. So we say, look, a portion of all of the money that we raise as a nonprofit, we are going to allow our community to decide how a portion of that budget gets spent to indicate which projects or focus areas our team focuses on. And so we do this connected to donations, but I think it's a really interesting model and we follow all of the steps. So we have a steering committee. We go through a really broad ideation phase. Anyone from anywhere, even if they haven't donated to PVP, can totally suggest an idea. Then we engage folks in proposal development, really ensuring that we understand what the proposal is, that it's feasible, that it's needed, that it's going to be something used by our broader community, whether it's a toolkit, you name it. And then we go through a vote phase. And I think it's a really interesting way to continue to build a network, but to model what participatory budgeting is inside of an organization. In this moment now, we're seeing a lot of organizations reach out to us and say, how do we incorporate this into our advocacy for justice? How do we incorporate this into our culture of being, period, so that we can learn more about how to do it and then do it on a bigger and grander scale? And so right now, we're seeing PBP really begin to think about how we deepen relationships with advocates across the country that are in some really important fights. Like one that I wanted to lift up that you all might be more familiar with is what's happening in St. Louis with jail closures, but also in Los Angeles. And how do we really begin to divest from systems of harm and really begin to address root cause issues and be able to build solutions that are community driven by impacted folks. And I think this is a really good example of a fight that we're currently in and supporting. There are a lot of conversations right now about defunding the police. And I just wanted to lift up one story that I'm really excited about, and that's what's happening in Seattle, Washington. This was a campaign that was started around a $30 million demand from community to divest from the police department, with at least 12 million coming from Seattle PD. And I think there's been a lot of movement around this, and more recently, they won at least $3 million over the summer to be decided on by community. And I wanted to bring this up because there was a beautiful partnership with the Black Brilliance Project. Remember earlier, we were talking about data that's accessible, data that's built by people, maybe even using tools like participatory action research to design the data that's built by people so that it is accessible. This is just a beautiful instance of how that can look and what it does look like in Seattle. So I just wanted to lift that up. And when I show y'all some of the resources at the end, this is one that you might want to check out a little further, because the partnership with Dr. Sean Glaze here was just fantastic. So what I will close with is just a resource or two for y'all. Today, we spent a lot of time talking about participatory budgeting. And one of the things that's true is PB by itself can't work in a silo, right? We have to be able to train folks on various methodologies of not only participatory budgeting, but maybe making some decisions about policy so that PB can actually happen, and so that other equitable community-based decision-making efforts can be real. And so we started an initiative called Democracy Beyond Elections, where we're building some of those shared decision-making models with partners from across the country. Y'all should build some with us. Here's an example of one of these models. It's a participatory policymaking model, where we took the best parts of participatory budgeting and things like citizen juries and councils and really thought together around what is the customized instance that we can grow here, where community members can make decisions around policy. We talked about New York in the chat for half a second. We said New York does district-based PB, and I wish they did more. Well, the New York City Charter has changed recently. That would actually allow for citywide PB. Now, that could be as big as $500 million that community members decide on, maybe $1 billion that community members decide on. Setting that dollar amount is still part of the fight, but actually winning the charter amendment has already happened. So there's a community mandate that's codified now for potentially the largest instance of participatory budgeting in the country, maybe even the world, right? And so I think that's this big, there's a lot of opportunity for growth here. One other resource that I just wanted to lift up, in addition to Democracy Beyond Elections, is while we didn't spend a ton of time on case studies today, I wanted to just bring up a series that we did, a video series, again, accessible information. We called it Visions for Justice. if you check out our website, we did a 5-part series that kind of goes into some of those case studies that I just described, like Seattle and some of these other really important elements across the country where folks are really thinking about not only divest, invest, but building people power for community-led decisions that center equity. And so those are some of the things that we maybe didn't get to today, but let me pause for a second and see how much time we have left, and if we do have time for another question or two.